Hey, I'm Warren Sprouse. This is the Bible Forum. We get together every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. To look at life through a biblical lens. We were looking at the Reformation, Martin Luther and the 95 Thesis. You can see that on the YouTube that precedes this particular episode. But I wanted to share some things. There's not enough time tonight to go into the whole of it, and one day we want to do that. But what I want you to understand is that growing out of the Reformation came a tremendous work of God that was built on God's gift of grace and God's gift of righteousness to human beings. And in the midst of that grew another movement that became known as Arminianism, from Jacobus Arminius, who was a teacher, a pastor, and who held to a little bit of a difference in the way this thing worked. And he was questioned about this on several occasions, and the answers he gave were sufficient for folks in charge, at least, to say, no, he agrees with us. But after he died, his students began to further his teaching, and they were not as careful in slicing it down and balancing the two parts. And out of that grew this debate that ended up being the is it a council or synod of Dort, which is in Holland. And these folks were invited to come and to present their case, to hear, what the church fathers had to say. They called themselves the Remonstrants because they were making remonstrances against the status quo. Out of that came 5 points that they labeled as Calvinism, after John Calvin in Switzerland, who came largely after this event, by the way. He wasn't like he founded any of this, but he was the foremost representative of it, largely through his institutes. He wrote volumes of doctrinal books. And matched over against that were 7 principles that the Remonstrants had that were boiled down to 5. If you look at these, you will find that they pretty much match up, point for point, coming down the line. A little variations early on, but if you have not drifted over into evangelical Arminianism, if you have not drifted over into semi-Pelagianism, then you believe, out of the 5 points of Calvinism, you believe largely 4 of them. There's just one that's a sticking point. And the sticking point is whether or not God has chosen before the foundation of the world to redeem some, but not all. Now, trying to think of the name. There is a group that goes too far with that. They say that God has chosen some to believe, and he has chosen some to be condemned. We're getting into the weeds here. I think that's the supralapsarian view, or the sub. Anyway, you take the Bible Institute courses, but when we get to soteriology, we cover this. Hardly anybody believes that stuff. But whatever's left over, even the Arminian agrees that there's nothing in us native that's good enough to be righteous. There's nothing in us native good enough to exhibit the faith that's necessary. As we looked at Martin Luther, his whole discussion of Romans 1:17, the whole idea was that faith is a gift. God's gift to us is not just faith, it's grace. Grace and faith are both gifts. Everybody believes that. It's just when we get a little bit further down the road that it starts to twist. Now, some Arminians take such a strong position against Calvinism, they actually end up semi-Pelagian. And Pelagius believed that human beings had all they needed internally to be able to relate to God and to decide yea or nay. It was a human thing. That was considered heresy. Today we have semi-Pelagian. They don't go so far as to say that, but they get close. They're doing some of that. And some Arminians are like that. We have evangelical Arminianism, which is not the classic Arminianism. There's Methodist Arminianism, which is not classic Arminianism. We've all moved away from whatever the foundation was, whatever the solid rock is, and we all got verses to back them up and sort them out. If you have 5 verses that support the fact that God, before the foundation of the world, chose people in Christ, writing their names in a book before he did anything else, and I have 3 verses over here that say, not really, it isn't that you win. It's that there's something here we don't understand. So rather than fighting with one another and making this a point of division, why can't we come together around the things that we actually believe? That was my thesis before the Ustream cut off and nobody heard it. I want to come back to that one day. We just talked about Reformation, Martin Luther. I also want to talk about this idea, the things that grew out of it as a result. But we're not going to do that tonight. But if that's of interest to you, then you need to sign up for the Bible Institute. You go to the website, Bible Institute, thebibleinstitute.org, and you can begin to sign up. Classes start in January.